I'm honored to have with me today Dr. Andrew Huff. He has an interesting book. It's titled, I'll let you just take a quick look at it here, The Truth About Wuhan, How I Discovered the Biggest Lie in History. And so we're going to have to fact check that. Is that the biggest lie in history?
Well, I believe so. I mean, these types of statements are always subjective in nature. I personally believe it's the biggest lie in history because if you look at the consequences of the event and the lies, millions of people are dead, trillions of dollars have been wasted. I was actually trained in analyzing national security risks and comparing different types of threats and risks against each other, and using this kind of quantitative method. That's how I came to this bold claim that this was the biggest lie in history.
Okay, so tell us what is your status to be able to ascertain this? What's been your role in history, and what are your associations with EcoHealth Alliance, and how do those play in?
Yeah, sure. So I was a little bit about my background. So I was trained to be a national security scientist in pandemics, bioterrorism, biowarfare. I have a top secret, or had a top secret clearance through the Department of Energy, and I worked with all the different three-letter agencies as a subject matter expert in these areas. And I was actually on call to answer calls or respond to national emergencies while working at Sandia National Laboratories, which is a national security, one of the premier national security laboratories in the U.S. After working at EcoHealth Alliance, I got sick of working in the classified space, and I found this job at EcoHealth Alliance. I was hired as a senior scientist. I was quite successful, had a perfect performance review from Dr. Peter Daszak, who was my boss. I brought in about $6 million of funding in shorter, over 3 to 4 months, and I was promoted to vice president. Once I was promoted to vice president, I was really able to see what was going on under the hood as being an executive at the company.
What was?
Well, not what I expected. So when I was hired at EcoHealth Alliance, and one of the things that drew me there is that actually I had a change in perspective about world and life. I was sick of working in national security. I no longer wanted to work in the classified space. It's a big responsibility having top secret clearance, and you have to be careful about who you interact with and how you live your life. And I wanted to have a little bit more of my freedom back, and I didn't want to have this. I wanted to have higher impact work. So what happens oftentimes in the national security community is that you might have this analysis or result, or you might develop some technologies or methods. Those get classified, and then you go brief those to senior officials in the government, and then they go in a filing cabinet, and no one ever sees those. So my work wasn't having impact in my perspective. So EcoHealth Alliance had this mission where they were going to predict and forecast pandemics and prevent them by engaging in conservation. And I thought that was a really neat mission because that has face validity, meaning if you engage in conservation activities, you can prevent emerging infectious diseases. Well, once I'm promoted to vice president, I find out that none of this is true. There's actually no conservation taking place at the organization, not a single penny being spent on it. All of our work is actually the most of our profits are being spent on hunting for novel viruses, and mainly coronaviruses globally in bats, to conduct gain-of-function research and then make medical countermeasures or drugs. So once I find out this is the real business happening at EcoHealth Alliance, I'm pretty upset about it because here my boss has been lying to me since I interviewed through the time I was promoted. And it wasn't until I sat in these executive meetings where I really saw these things as being the core focus of the organization.
Yeah, and I wrote recently on EcoHealth Alliance. I had written an article for Brownstone on Dr. Fauci. Here are the articles. Just put them up very briefly. EcoHealth, they're actually in reverse order. So the first article I wrote here was Dr. Fauci's own gain of function. And EcoHealth Alliance wrote a letter in protest that they were not gain of function. They were not involved in gain of function. And so here's my article on that topic. And I don't know if I can find the quote. Maybe it's up here. That their work on EcoHealth claims the Wuhan work on bat coronavirus didn't meet the definition of gain of function, and asked that we amend the article with any such updates credit to an EcoHealth Alliance spokesperson. And so I go on and on and on and talk about what is gain of function and whatnot. What are your thoughts about that? Were you involved in Wuhan at all? And are you familiar with the work that was being done there?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a number of misconceptions first about the gain of function work. And so to go in order in which you set up this question. So first of all, gain of function is defined as anytime you enhance the environmental persistence, the virulence, the pathogenicity, the survivability of the agent, typically. And there's a couple other, nuanced definitions to that, but EcoHealth Alliance was definitely engaged in that work. And Dr. Anthony Fauci wasn't the first organization that funded this work. This work actually began under an agency called the United States Agency for International Development.
USAID.
Yeah, so the under USAID,
just stick to their 3-letter acronym of CIA.
Yeah, basically they have, and that's why I joke about it, and I talk about this in the book actually. The USAID has 60 years of failed CIA operations, which typically, USAID, their primary mission, what they tell everyone, is that they're going to bring aid. So a humanitarian aid in the forms of, buildings, food, doctors, and it's from the American people. That's their slogan. It's sort of a free-floating agency. It often reports to the State Department, but it is technically on its own. And it depends which president and what the administrative priorities are where it sits. But it's really sort of CIA State Department organization, and they do use it for clandestine operations. I mean, those are facts. So what's interesting here is the person that used to run this program his name is Dr. Dennis Carroll, and Dr. Dennis Carroll had this vision that they were going to go around the planet and collect viruses to be able to predict and forecast pandemics to ultimately prevent them. The problem is that sounded really neat, and actually that's my area of expertise, is building computer models and simulations using machine learning or artificial intelligence to forecast diseases. I'm actually one of the few people on the planet who's done that successfully. And once I start digging into the methods being used in this predict program, I quickly find that they're not collecting the right data, the right samples, the right sampling frequency to actually make these kind of forecasts. And then I start asking questions of meetings, of course, of, what are we doing and why? Dr. Ralph Barrick, one of the scientists from the University of North Carolina that we're partnered with, actually came and presented his work. And it was all clearly gain of function work, trying to make human coronaviruses transmissible to humans and actually increasing the infectivity of the agent. We actually discussed this gain of function work among the executive team and the scientists, where I opposed it in the executive meeting because at the time, going back in history, this gain of function work has been highly contentious. And there was really a bloody brawl among infectious disease scientists from 2000 to 2008, where the community was really debating whether or not we should be engaged in this gain of function work, because one half of the community, and I'll give the pro gain of function argument here first, their argument is that by engaging in gain of function research, we can get ahead of evolution. So we can make drugs, vaccines, medical countermeasures to prevent terrible disease in the form of morbidity or mortality. Well, that's sort of, in my mind, a God complex, and humans have never successfully predicted evolution. It hasn't happened. There's not one scientist who can claim that they've done that a priori. And my camp, and the camp that I've fallen into, is that we shouldn't be engaged in gain of function work because we can't predict evolution. And there's a high probability by engaging in this gain of function work that you'll have a laboratory accident, which could cause a pandemic. And there's just countless laboratory accidents that happen all over the nation from an occupation health or an environmental health perspective. I've ran a couple wet labs in my career. I was also a veterinary hospital epidemiologist, and accidents happen. That's the nature of doing lab work, working with infectious agents in the lab or in the field. It happens. And the chances or probability of that happening are much greater when you're dealing with BSL-4 or 3 agents, because if you have a highly infectious disease, which you can't see, and you're working out underneath the hood, and you have all this personal protective equipment on, but you can't see it, right? It's in the air. It's aerosolized. It just takes the tiniest small mistake, and then a worker can become ill in that laboratory. And then if it is highly transmissible, community spread happens rapidly. And typically with these types of aerosolized diseases, it only takes a matter of probably 4 to 5 days for the agent to escape the laboratory, to start to hop continents. because of the network nature of air travel. So it happens real quickly. So this gets in this whole other idea of, lockdown strategy and why that was a bad idea. But back to your question here, EcoHealth Alliance was definitely engaged in gain of function work. I have all the documents to prove it. I released these on Twitter over a year ago. And in Dr. Dasik's own word, they describe in detail the experiments that they're doing, how it began with USAID. When the funding runs out from USAID or the seed funding to do this work, it is transferred to Dr. Anthony Fauci in my section of NIAID, which is infectious disease and respiratory pulmonary disorders, called IRAP. And the program continues to be funded through NIH. So I leave EcoHealth Alliance in 2016. And then if you look at the proposals, and this thing called the diffuse proposal, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the diffuse proposal was a proposal that EcoHealth Alliance submitted to the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, where my friend Charles Rixey, he's not feeling well, but he's upstairs. He's actually at my house today. The Department of Defense leaked it to him. Major Murphy leaked it to Charles Rixey, and Charles Rixey publishes it, and it's the exact recipe and methods to make SARS-CoV-2. You should go look this up. It's called the diffuse proposal.
How do you spell it?
DEFUSE.
Oh, diffuse.
Diffuse. It could be my funny Minnesota accent. Sometimes people have a hard time understanding it. So the diffuse proposal comes out, and it names all the different scientists and laboratories involved. It goes to DARPA, and I can add some context to this. So typically scientists, when they're good at their jobs, work 2 to 3 to 4 years ahead of their funding. Meaning when we submit grant proposals, we're not really asking for the money to do that work. We've already completed the work and know that the experiments work when we ask for the funding, because that's how you guarantee that your project will be funded by the agencies. So EcoHealth Alliance, when I worked there, we're all 2 to 3 years ahead on our funding, including this gain of function work. So when we were submitting proposals asking Dr. Anthony Fauci for money for the project, we already had the first 2 years of that project complete. And I have the documents to prove that, which I've already released. And everything that I've told you, by the way, I've either put in written form, written testimony under oath with penalty of perjury, or given in depositions.
That is fascinating. My original article had some illustrations, and that funny one from the diffuse proposal.
It looks like Dr. Kevin Olival. He's one of the other executives. Sort
of mimics this one here. This is from EcoHealth Alliance's own pages. Let's see who's in this one here. It's Shi Zhengli, Peter Daszak. I'm not sure who else. They're in caves looking for bat coronavirus, I gather. Mm-hmm. And for those unfamiliar, Shi Zhengli is the famous or infamous bat woman of Wuhan. Did you ever get to meet her, and what was the relationship between Peter Daszak and her?
Yeah, so Peter was under this PREDICT program before NIH gets involved. So imagine the globe, and we have all these different countries with emerging infectious disease risks, and there were 3 different companies involved, or organizations. The lead contractor was the University of California, Davis. The second company involved was EcoHealth Alliance, where I worked, and there was another company called Metabiota, all engaged in this global infectious disease surveillance work for USAID. What would happen at the beginning of the funding of these projects is that the three companies, we'd get together, or 3 organizations, and we'd argue and debate and fight over who was going to have which countries. What's interesting about this is that for whatever reason, we always received the China contract at EcoHealth Alliance, and Dr. Peter Daszak had a very strong relationship with the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the Chinese, just generally speaking, all the different Chinese entities, their version of the CDC, and other academic institutions all over China, actually. So I was actually offered the position to be on the China project with Peter Daszak, but I didn't really know what I didn't know at that time when I was offered that position, because I was concerned with the various national security risks and the implications of me having a top secret clearance at the time, working with these people, because everyone in the national security community knew that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was likely the bioweapons laboratory of the Chinese. And one of the things that I discuss in my book, which when you get a chance to read it, is that, and it's a fun question to ask. So why were the Americans allowed into the Wuhan Institute of Virology at all? So if we know it's their bioweapons lab, or the national security folks who, like I knew when I worked at EcoHealth Alliance, why do you think the Chinese allowed us into that laboratory?
Well, it's an open question. I mean, I can imagine why we wanted to be there. It's kind of like spy versus spy. And if you ever saw the Mad Magazine comic, there's the black spy and the white spy, and they're always trying to do plots on each other and keep tabs on each other and trail each other and whatnot. And I've seen enough movies, this double inverse mole, and so I imagine we wanted to keep an eye on them, and they wanted to keep an eye on us.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But so you have the context of this. You're dead on. I agree with everything you're saying. But the Chinese would have a lot to risk by just allowing Americans to come into that laboratory to look to see what they're going on. And let's face it, China has all the money in the world, so they didn't need $250,000 or $500,000 in the contract to execute this work. They can go do all the gain of function work that they want to. So, what were the Chinese gaining, and from this work? What do you think?
Well, I would think they're gaining plausible deniability, that they could spread the downside risk. If something were to happen, they could have leverage over those participants. If you're part of a fraud, or if you're part of a conspiracy, you're less likely to spill the beans about it after the fact.
Yeah, I think that's good as well. So, and I'll give you what I hypothesize in the book based on my experience. So the Chinese typically are very transactional, and they will not engage in something like this unless they're getting something out of it. Well, they're getting the cash, and maybe that helps pay bribes or laboratory fees or wherever the money goes. But the thing that they were really getting was the most advanced biotechnology in the world. It was well known in that time period, back in 2014, 2015, that the Chinese were probably about 8 to 10 years behind the United States in terms of this advanced biotechnology. Work being done in Texas by several different scientists, and at the University of North Carolina was transferred. That technology was
similar to the way that they kind of had American automotive companies come over, and then they wind up conveniently going out of business, while the Chinese have duplicated all their casts and dies and procedures, and they make their own version of the Chevrolet or whatever, the Sherry instead of the Chevy or something like that. So they're pretty much mimicking, kind of like similar to what Hamas does. They take a shell from Israeli whatever, and then they mock up, or Iran gets a downed drone, and they mock it up, and they just replenish and restock based on stolen designs.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in this context, it's so mind-boggling to me why this was allowed. And have you ever heard of export control? Are you familiar with this?
You can elaborate. Go ahead.
Okay, so export control is part of the State Department usually, or the CIA gets involved. And export control, their job is to monitor all the transfer advanced materials, technology, and science out of the United States to make sure that it's not winding up in enemy hands. So going back in time once again, the French are kicked out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Americans and Westerners can't get access to it. So that the way that we get access to that laboratory is by transferring the biotechnology. And, sort of genius, but, I actually asked the question in an executive meeting. So when we were going around the table and we were splitting up all the different countries that we're going to work in after I rejected China, I raised the objection. I actually said this. Aren't we concerned that the Chinese are going to steal from us, rip us off, or screw this up in some way? I actually said that in an executive meeting. And the Chinese have a long history of stealing technology from the United States, and that was one of my primary concerns. And I wasn't really saying it out of protection for the United States. I was actually trying to protect my company, because as an executive, I was trying to protect Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance from the Chinese stealing from us. And how little did I know, because we were giving them that for the access. I just didn't really put this all together mentally until about 2020 or 2021 after the pandemic started.
So is EcoHealth Alliance a private company? Is it an NGO? I mean, a nonprofit? What is their organization? And what is their actual structure? What do you think their actual interest is?
Yeah, so they're structured as a nonprofit organization. They used to be registered in the state of Massachusetts, actually. They operate out of New York City. It was a very profitable nonprofit. At least when I started, it changed over time, actually, their profitability. So when I started at EcoHealth Alliance, I didn't know that they were underwater. The money that I brought into the organization helped transform the organization and kept it afloat. I guess for better or worse, I'm somewhat culpable in all of this. So EcoHealth then becomes extremely profitable because when I'm brought into the company, I'm the only person there with a public health background. And I'm also tied to the defense community in a lot of different domains in and around pandemics and biological weapons and things. So our portfolio work rapidly starts to expand into DoD, DHS, and other three-letter agencies. Another interesting thing happened while I worked at EcoHealth Alliance. So in late 2015, around the Christmas or holidays, Dr. Peter Dask and I stay late. It's about 9:00 at night. We're closing down the office. And as we walk out into the vestibule to lock up the door, Dr. Dask goes to me and says, "Andrew, do you mind if I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure, Peter, go ahead." Someone from the CIA approached me. They're interested in the places that we've been working, the people we've been meeting with, and the data we're collecting. And then he mumbled something about the Chinese. And he said, "Do you think it's a good idea that we work with them?" And I couldn't believe that he was asking me this. I mean, first of all, I came from a top secret background. Typically, you don't go talking about intelligence in the vestibule of a public building in New York City. I mean, this was so strange. I sort of perceived my boss as having foreign ties. I didn't really know whether or not he would actually interact with a person without seeing their credentials. So, like, how did he know that this person was actually from the CIA and not from some foreign intelligence or business? So quickly, I tell him, I go, "Peter, it never hurts to talk to them. There could be money in it." Well, then over the next 2 to 3 months in between meetings, he confirmed that the relationship with the CIA was progressing. And now when I reflect back on this, much of what we were doing was out in the open, intelligence collection in terms of biosecurity, biosafety. And none of this is a secret. There's numerous policy documents from the U.S. government where you can go talk about their need to reduce international biological threat. And they reduce that threat through these types of programs. So, I don't really find any of this shocking, but what's strange is how the U.S. government has lied to everyone about what EcoHealth Alliance is and what it's actually doing and this gain of function work.
So let's go back to the central aspect of your book title, The Biggest Lie. What do you find? I mean, this sounds like there are multiple levels of lying. What do you think was the biggest lie?
Oh, of the book? Well, it's really the question is the cover up worse than the crime? And I believe it is in this case. To this day, the COVID Select Committee, and I was just posting about this on Twitter before we began this interview, they're trying to push now a November narrative for the emergence of SARS-CoV-2. Mm-hmm. Well, I point this out in the book, and there's a couple different ways you can look at this. You can look at the science and the intelligence. So if you reverse model the case data back from March 2020, June 2020, and you use the transmission rate, and basically it's like a square root kind of process. Mm-hmm. You can find what the likely emergence
least square roots, isn't it, or something?
Yeah, at least square roots. Well, I try to simplify things because I don't know where people are at. So through this reduction process, though, this time sequence analysis, you come to what the likely estimated emergence timeline is, and that's late August or early September 2019. Now, me being the spooky scientist that I've been over the years, we use science and intelligence together. So then if you actually look at the intelligence reports that have been coalesced around this, a master's student gets sick in that laboratory in late August, September of 2019. EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology take down databases containing genetic sequences a week or two after that event. Then after that event, the Chinese in September panic buy emergency containment equipment to get ahead of the leak. You fast forward to October, the World Military Games in Wuhan occur. Athletes from all over the planet report coming down with pneumonia-like illness. Event 201, you have the CIA orchestrating global governments or working with global governments and high wealth individuals to plan for a future pandemic. But the disease is already spreading, and everyone knows this.
Didn't they actually use a coronavirus as part of their war gaming?
Yes, and at the World Military Games, on the field of the opening ceremony, there's a big coronavirus displayed on the field. All the athletes report that the CCP employees working the games are in high-vet suits, taking their temperatures, and the city's on lockdown. So obviously China already knows that this disease is spreading. And because I used to build these platforms and these infectious disease surveillance tools for the Department of Defense, I know how well they work. And so if I have all this intelligence and I was able to collect this, not being in the classified system anymore, not having access to that information, when do you think the U.S. government knew that this disease started spreading? And what they're supposed to do, and you're a doctor, do no harm, duty to warn. And they don't engage in those activities. What they do is they immediately go into cover-up mode because they know that this has the U.S. fingerprints all over it. They know it's the most terrible trade in history because here we traded the Chinese this advanced technology for access to their laboratory so we could collect intelligence. I mean, it's the most ridiculous thing in the world. And it's
here we had some intelligence, presumably, and then we didn't use it. We buried it.
Well, correct. I mean, this is why I'm a constitutional libertarian, because the government tends to screw up more things, and then problems it solves. And you just can't make this stuff up. I mean, so a little bit more about my background. I started off my career in the military as an infantryman. I served in Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. And we used to make jokes all the time about the things that the Department of Defense could screw up. And it's akin to what you see and observe happening around SARS-CoV-2 in the intelligence community. So big, huge bureaucratic systems where we have few strong and effective leaders.
Now, I'm going to ask you a few questions on background. It's a little bit off topic potentially, but in the interregnum between 2003 SARS, which wasn't called SARS-1, but we'll call SARS-1, and 2019 SARS-2, there were some efforts at creating a coronavirus vaccine because the Chinese, I think, were really flummoxed and upset by SARS-1. They tried to move people around. They have their heavy-handed methods of human movement, closing cities, all that kind of stuff. And so some people with SARS-1 were moved from one place to another, and the place that became the recipient city, there were riots. And they have, Tiananmen Square allergy. They don't want that again. And I think they were very much wary of having any kind of civil disturbance, probably causing their overreaction, closing cities down for SARS-2. Are you familiar with, or are anybody on the EcoHealth Alliance team familiar with the efforts to make a SARS-1 vaccine and the failures thereof, the problems with it? And how does SARS-1 work relate to the eventual creation of SARS-2?
So I think EcoHealth Alliance, you have to look at how it functioned as an organization. So in the core of the company, there were probably only 30 to 35 employees. Of those, probably only 5 or 6 had PhDs or advanced degrees, or like DVMs or MDs. And Peter Daszak is a zoologist. Dr. Billy Koresh is a veterinarian field epidemiologist, so he might have been certainly qualified. He was a very, very bright individual. I don't believe Dr. Daszak would have been qualified to answer any of those questions. Dr. Kevin Olival, who was about my age or just a hair older than me, but he was a disease ecologist, probably not qualified. Dr. John Epstein, another vice president who's in a number of these publications, he might have the expertise. He's a sharp epidemiologist and veterinarian, has a lot of lab work under his belt with Dr. Ian Lipkin at Columbia University. But to the extent that they had the background knowledge that they were actually following the vaccine development timeline for SARS-CoV-1, if you want to call it that, vaccine SARS-1, no, I don't think so, because nobody was really following so close. And to the extent that I followed it in my career, I came at it from a different angle. So going back to 2006, 2008, I was still an undergraduate at that time, and I had just got out of the military. Fast forward to when I get my master's degree in engineering and with a national security focus in 2010 or 11, I become aware of this issue of the need for a game-changing vaccine. the main problem with current or old, I should say old vaccine technology is that you have to grow the virus in egg protein, and that takes 9 months. And then you have to scale up enough egg production and vaccine development to cover, 300 million doses in the United States for something like a pandemic. By the time that you actually develop the vaccine and run testing and trials on it, it's too late. The disease is spread all over the planet if it's something really bad. And this was something that everyone in the national security community was, with a biological focus or public health focus, was keenly aware of. So there was the idea that we could develop a game-changing vaccine using mRNA technology that could be rapidly edited and deployed in case of a national emergency. mRNA starts being discussed in these circles at high-level government meetings, which I participate in as early as 2012 or 2013, and essentially continue until it's actually selected for responding to the coronavirus pandemic. From my mentors, I've learned that those conversations actually took place all the way back to, like I said, though, 2006 or 2008, around using mRNA for pandemic response.
Well, that's fascinating. So your book came out. What's been the response to it? What have the reviews been like, and what are the criticisms?
Yeah, so let's tackle the criticisms first. That's always fun. So the day before my book was actually available on market, someone seeded an article or information about my book to the New York Post and some Australian publications, saying that I was a fraud because I did not work in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Well, I've never made that claim that I worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, first of all. I worked at the organization that funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I reviewed all the proposals for the gain-of-function work to be conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And actually, I have the best credentials in terms of public health, epidemiology, or environmental health at EcoHealth Alliance when I worked there. I received a perfect performance review, excellent, while I worked at EcoHealth Alliance from Dr. Peter Daszak till we had our falling out. And I actually brought in the most funding outside of Dr. Peter Daszak to the organization and made it solvent. So I'm actually involved in a number of court cases against EcoHealth Alliance and the federal government as the star witness, because I'm not only an expert, I'm a firsthand witness to the fraud and lies and the deceit, which has been going on for the past 2 years.
Well, let me ask you here. There's an EcoHealth, I'm going to put it up for you. There's an EcoHealth Alliance statement regarding book by Andrew Huff. I'll see if I can make this bigger. Have you read this?
Yes, I have. And there are a number of bots and people posting that all over my posts when they first put it up. The great thing about that, and if you read there, it doesn't address any of my claims that I've made under oath with penalty of perjury. So it's pretty funny that, they put out the statement, but they don't really actually address anything that I've said.
Let's just kind of stick on number 2 for a second.
Sure.
And we can get to the other ones, but this one's central to my article and the complaint that EcoHealth Alliance had about my Dr. Fauci article. Mr. Huff alleges that EcoHealth Alliance was engaged in gain-of-function research to create SARS-CoV-2. This is not true.
Well, it sounds like it's something Peter Daszak would say in the way that his writing style. I have the documents to prove it, and I've already released those documents. So, and they're in Dr. Peter Daszak's own words. I mean, he was the principal investigator that signed off on those proposals. And I sat at the presentations, and I've testified under oath with penalty of perjury, or provided sworn declarations under oath with penalty of perjury. And I'm the only person that's willing to talk on the record. All these other people have lawyered up, and they refuse to talk on the record.
Let's go with number 4 for a second. Mr. Huff claims that SARS-CoV-2 emerged as a lab leak, but based on research conducted there in background, and further that his research was related to U.S. intelligence and gathering efforts. They have this one blanket. This is not true. Now, this is like 3 statements in one. So let's look at them individually. I mean, it's kind of a bit much to say that this is not true. Maybe they're saying all these 3 things together are not true. But if we take them one by one, you say that it emerged as a lab leak. This was written in 2022. I think since then, we have pretty much confirmed, and I mean, I knew all along that, I didn't know, but I had my very, very strong 90% greater likelihood suspicion that it was that a leak from Wuhan. They're saying this is not true. I mean, I think that's fraudulent. But if they want to continue saying, based on research conducted there, and further this research was related to U.S. intelligence gathering. So there's three things. They're saying this is not true could mean that the confluence of these three things, that is a lab leak based on research from the U.S. intelligence effort. So tell me, true, false? You be the judge.
Well, it's interesting how you break that apart, and I'll take each clause of that statement apart. So I think we both agree that this leaked out of a laboratory. And if you actually look at the genetic sequences of SARS-CoV-2, the smoking gun was published by Dr. Saeed Khan. So he ran the SARS-CoV-2 sequence through what's called the BLAST database. The BLAST database is an NIH system which has millions or billions of genetic sequences in it. And interestingly, he found one of the sequences inside of, or one of the inserts inside of the sequence for SARS-CoV-2 was patented by Moderna in 2015. And there was another one that was...
It's a coincidence.
Yeah, and there was another one that was patented by Moderna in 2016. So that's a 1 in a trillion chance that could occur naturally. And I have enough inside information when I look at the sequences and the types of things we're working at. Those were right around the types of work that we were doing or proposing when I worked at EcoHealth Alliance, and that Moderna sequence was likely patented from either Ralph Barrett's work based on the sample collections that we had conducted in Southeast Asia. Now, let's take a next look at that next clause to make sure I cover this. So the next part of it was, what does it say? Okay. So yes, it was based on bat coronaviruses, but here's the thing: they could be a little bit slippery here in pulling a lawyer trick. So the problem is, once these sequences are actually loaded into something like BLAST, people like Ralph Barrett can synthetically generate them. So they don't actually have to have a copy of the sample to have the sequence and generate it. They can actually synthetically create it from the recipe, so to speak. So there might be a little bit of a nuanced lawyer trick there, but needless to say, the foundational work of this was from bat coronaviruses. The last part, as being part of intelligence collection activities, I guess they could, be playing devil's advocate here. I'm basing that on my own assessment of being a national security expert and a person that was an advisor to various three-letter agencies with a top secret clearance, and that's something that none of these people possess. It's just a fact. Put the shoe on the other foot. If I were working at Sandia National Laboratories in a SCIF in a top secret part of the laboratory, we would not bring the Chinese into the laboratory and take them on a tour of our most sensitive and classified areas unless we were getting something for it or we were a partnership with them on some kind of endeavor. And if they were just coming to visit, we'd bug sweep them before they entered the lab. We'd have a minder watching them everywhere where they went. We'd bug sweep it when they left, and we would never show them anything of importance. So, you have to look here, what's the truth of the context? There is no reason for the Chinese to be engaged in this work with the United States unless they're getting something out of it. And let's face it, they didn't need our money. And if they didn't need our money, then why do this?
Good question. I'm going to read, carry on, and I'm going to leave that as a rhetorical question lying out there. But let's carry on with EcoHealth's letter. Dr. Francis Collin, NIH head, issued this statement. NIH wants to set the record straight on NIH-supported research to understand naturally occurring bat coronavirus, WIV, funded through a subaward NIH to EcoHealth Alliance. Analysis of published genomic data and other documents from the grantee, that's EcoHealth Alliance, demonstrate that the naturally occurring bat coronaviruses studied are genetically far distant from SARS-CoV-2 and could not, I like this, how he knows this, and could not possibly have caused the COVID-19 pandemic. Any claims to the contrary are demonstrably false. Now, this is kind of yelling and screaming. There's an old expression in the law: if the facts are on your side, argue the facts. If the law is on your side, argue the law. If you have neither one, then yell, jump, scream, and divert. I think this is diversionary. And let's go on. The scientific evidence to date indicates that the virus is likely. So he's saying demonstrably false, and now he goes into likely the result of viral evolution in nature, potentially jumping directly to humans, blah, blah, blah. So it's basically, eco, caused pandemics, and including influenza, Ebola, Zika, West Nile fever, SARS, and more. So all these other ones go from, the zoonotic world, animals into humans. Therefore, this must have as well. Anyway, more importantly, importantly, after an intensive investigation, agencies in the U.S. intelligence community, which is not involved somehow, agreed that the virus was not developed as a biologic weapon, and most agencies assessed that SARS-CoV-2 was most likely not genetically engineered. I think there's a lot of, hedging your bets on this. I mean, this is not a denial that it was created in the lab. This last part says that the virus was not created, not developed as a biologic weapon. It's almost implying, in fact, it was developed. So here they're saying that it wasn't developed, it's natural, but if it was, but here's things not developed as a biological weapon. I suppose with nature, bats don't know how to make biological weapons, but even to mention this seems to be implicitly allowing for that it was done in the lab. And most agencies assessed that SARS-CoV-2 was not genetically engineered. Well, of course, that means that some agencies did assess that it was. And again, they hedge this with not likely engineered. So I kind of find that a little bit, I guess, farcical, hilarious, funny, and also tragic. And sad.
No, and you're all over this, and I mean there's so many different things I can unpack here. But if you look at the last statement of that paragraph, most of the agencies actually now believe that it was a laboratory leak. Most of the agencies do believe that it was genetically engineered. The only question, there's the CIA and the ODNI, which refuse to release a conclusive report because they're likely involved with this. And we do have the fact that Dr. Anthony Fauci was being snuck into CIA headquarters in the middle of the night to help analysts write the reports. And when the analysts refused,
I'm going to stop you there right there. How do we know he was snuck in there in the middle of the night? What's the evidence of that? I mean, I've seen this, and it's part of the U.S. House Congress intelligence or whatever it is, the COVID committee thing. But if he was snuck in the middle of the night, how do we know that?
Because the analysts came forward as whistleblowers and they had accepted bribes from the CIA to change the perspective on their reports when they refused to change.
But how do we know Fauci was snuck into CIA, whatever? How is that?
I assume that it came from whistleblower testimony is what I thought, because
fair enough. So that's hearsay. We don't have like a video or a timestamp or anything like that. And
I don't know if it's hearsay. So I guess here's the issue. If we could get access to the whistleblower complaint that was submitted to Congress by the analysts. So one of these analysts came forward as a whistleblower, like I've done, with some of these agencies that were involved with this. Those documents carry penalty of perjury and other serious consequences if you lie as a whistleblower. And apparently Congress thought it was enough to go on. Usually they validate or cross-validate this information with investigators before they go forward with it. Otherwise, they lose a lot of credibility. It could just be a political hit job. I didn't take it that way. So, I mean, I guess if you say it's hearsay,
I just haven't seen any pictures of him doing it. He hasn't admitted it. I haven't heard anybody from the CIA, and they're not likely to announce it. Anyway, I just leave that out there. That kind of made it into my article on Fauci. Because I think it's fascinating. I do think something happened, on various levels that implied, what's the word? Cover CYA, covering one's posterior based on potential culpability or involvement with something, some type of chicanery, something you shouldn't have been involved in. So I think it's clear, if we were to roll this back in time, that the Wuhan virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where they had been keeping the SARS-1 to play around with. They've been working on vaccines for years. They couldn't make one, but they had it around, and clearly there's some gain of function going on, and the thing leaked. And so if I were an honest Dr. Fauci, which I hope wouldn't be an oxymoron, but I think it is, I would have said, oh my God, you know what? Mea culpa. He went to Holy Cross, so he would know what that means. And he'd say, I feel horrible. We were snookered into this. We wanted to keep an eye on the Wuhan. We shouldn't have been there probably, but apparently this is from Wuhan. We're going to be all on this. We know all about this thing, blah, blah, blah. He kind of talked out of both sides of his mouth. I don't want to talk too much about my article, but it quotes him in February 2020 saying that the coronavirus impact should be minuscule, literally. That's the word he uses, minuscule. And I think it would have been had he just left it alone to be its own little virus self. And I mean, equivalent to say a flu without a vaccine. Fine. So that we have flus now, we have vaccines, so not as bad as they would be in 1930. I get it. But he didn't do that. He kind of was weaseling around and back and forth, one thing and another. And we wound up having, treating this like a Chinese bioweapon and using Chinese lockdown methodology, which is tragic. I'm not going to, bore you with all that per se, but unless to the extent that I already have.
No, so it's funny. So I actually contributed to the preparation of several of the national pandemic preparedness plans while being an employee at San Diego National Laboratories. So the 2 weeks to buy time was part of the national pandemic preparedness plans. And the reason why the 2 weeks to stop the spread, or whatever they want to call it, the marketing term, makes sense is it
flatten the curve. Flatten the curve.
Yeah, flatten the curve. Well, that's really not what we put in the document. The 2 weeks is merely for the U.S. government to buy some time to assess the situation, mobilize or reorganize and mobilize before they attack it. There was no, in the national pandemic preparedness plans, there's multiple of these. There was never a recommendation that there would be a long-term lockdown. Actually, it said the opposite. And the things that we discussed in the policy methods and levers that we tested, we've revolved around school closures. If we had a vaccine, what the vaccine strategy would be like. And these were highly complex, sophisticated models, agent-based models for the entire population of the United States, which were network and geographic. We did this on one of the best supercomputers that the U.S. government owns. And we tested these things to beat death. Sensitivity analysis on every input parameter and questioning our assumptions. And this is what wound up in the official, what led the U.S. Government's official guidance. So I'm intimately familiar with it. But the problem is the U.S. government, and this is why I was so scared to come forward as a whistleblower. When I start seeing all these different people lying about what the policy was of the U.S. government, they keep flip-flopping back and forth on mask guidance, flat out lying to people about the stopping the spread stuff. I was scared, actually, because I immediately knew that I couldn't trust anyone in the government that I had been previously working before, because they're making all these crazy decisions. And to go back to actually Dr. Peter Daszak's paragraph, whether or not they're engaged in bioweapons research, it's a catch-22 based on the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention. So under that convention, international treaty members are not allowed to engage in biologic weapons research. However, there's the caveat. If you're going to develop medical countermeasures, you can do gain-of-function work. So like I said, the whole debate around gain-of-function work is that if you engage in it, you can make medical countermeasures. So the problem is, to make the countermeasure, you have to make the bioweapon first. So this is the dirty little secret that's going on internationally. And when the domestic ban on gain-of-function goes into place during the Obama administration, they partner with the Chinese, they collect intelligence on the Chinese, they outsource outside the United States. And then the crazy thing is, Dr. Daszak actually received a letter when I worked at EcoHealth Alliance from NIH stating that they perceived that he was outside, or this project was outside of regulation. And they allowed Dr. Daszak to write the rules and to explain why his project was within regulatory guidelines, even though there was a domestic ban. So, all of this stuff's super incriminating, but there's so many nuanced detail this and so much information. I think the average person is typically overwhelmed.
I know, I agree with that. Here's from my article. We're talking about here, Dr. Fauci's, NIH acknowledged that EcoHealth Alliance experiments it had funded in Wuhan in 2018 resulted in a coronavirus more virulent in mice. The Science magazine noted that EcoHealth Alliance failure to report this very finding represented a violation of the NIH's grant terms precluding gain of function. It is therefore axiomatic, these are my words, that EcoHealth Alliance's experiments fall under the definition of gain of function research, a point that Richard Ebright affirmed in the following tweet he sent out with a copy of the NIH letter here. NIH corrects untruthful assertions by NIH director, the aforementioned Francis Collins, and Dr. Fauci that NIH had not funded gain of function. This is double negative research. Basically, they're saying that they had. NIH states that EcoHealth Alliance violated terms and conditions of meaning it was gain of function, and everyone seems to know this. So I got a letter from Robert Kessler, who's a young gentleman who works for EcoHealth Alliance. He countered this, saying that a bat coronavirus is not known to be able to infect humans. This is the letter he's writing today, basically a couple months ago. Kessler's claims ignore independent scientific documentation from EcoHealth Alliance, frankly, in 2005 and 2015, and contradicts Peter Daszak, who noted in 2018 that he and Batwoman Zheng Li Shi, or Shi Zheng Li, whatever how you pronounce it, had found serologic evidence of bat infections in humans. more of her claims, et cetera. It goes on and on. So this, like, it seems a lot of kind of, I use the term weaseling.
Oh, totally. I mean, and everything EcoHealth Alliance did was very weaselly. And really, why I end up leaving EcoHealth Alliance is that I discover all these things. I discover a significant amount of financial fraud, and I really didn't know how bad it was. But when I brought up the financial fraud at our meeting, our CFO went at home and had a heart attack and died. Well, I thought it was to the tune of a couple $100,000. Well, investigator Diane Cutler continued to investigate this financial fraud after I talked about it. She discovered over $120 million of financial fraud at EcoHealth Alliance, which likely began while I worked at EcoHealth Alliance. Like I said, they were having financial difficulties. And there's a simple fact that most people aren't aware of. So to make yourself, your company, a target of espionage, or the intelligence community, have some vulnerability, like being financially insolvent, because those types of organizations, the intelligence community, will target companies based on their financial health. And based on that alone, and you look at the ego and the personality characteristics of Dr. Daszak, he's the exact kind of person that the intelligence community goes to target when they want someone to work with, because he's got a big ego, he wants money, he wants power, and that's exactly what they deal to people that they want to use.
Okay, well, I'm gonna leave that as a value judgment, negative or neutral. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing that the CIA would want to use somebody like that, because I mean, if you're in China, and China's at least our cold war-ish enemy, if not full, hot war enemy. I mean, it's not. If you're going to get somebody there, why not? I'm not opposed to that per se. I'm not sure that necessarily plays in. What I don't like is the after the fact lies and denials and squirming, in the way that those probably wound up aggrandizing our own goal, our self-damage, our social suicide by via lockdowns, because people were not able to be upfront because they have this kind of guilt or complicity. That's the issue I have. I don't have a problem with the fact that CIA has spies. As long as we're going to have a CIA, you got to have spies. And if as long as you're going to have enemies, they're probably worth spying on. I'm not opposed to that. I mean, that is intelligence is, maybe they say that military intelligence is an oxymoron, but I do think that, intelligence as a form of knowledge is useful. That's how we get ahead in the world, by learning things. That's what we're doing right now, trying to learn through and trying to get more intelligent. So I'm not opposed to that part. I'm just really, curious whether, once you work for intelligence, whether anything that comes out of your mouth is true anymore.
So I agree with you fundamentally. So I've never, I've been on the side of intelligence gathering, and I've actually benefited from intelligence collection in that secret world. I think the issue here with Peter Daszak specifically, and the work they were doing, is that they were being deceitful to the American public about it. And the work that they were doing with the Chinese, specifically with this technology transfer, was a stupid idea and unethical. Right. And any scientist, if he's a good scientist, should have had the ethics and values in trying to protect the company, EcoHealth Alliance, not to be engaged in the first place.
Fair enough. So people are allowed to be stupid. I'm stupid, a good fraction of the day, probably.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, it seems to be more common when I'm around my wife, but I don't know. That could just be her opinion. I don't know. Who knows? Who can tell these things? Where is the science? I'm going to kind of finish off this letter here. From EcoHealth Alliance. You say it's from Peter Daszak himself. I don't know. Substantial published evidence indicates that COVID-19 originated via a similar pathway to SARS. So they're saying zoonotic, including a spillover from bats to intermediate human hosts, then to people, wildlife trade, Hunan seafood market, blah, blah, blah. This kind of old tripe we've heard. The hypothesis that SARS-CoV-2 was created in a laboratory is now widely considered less probable than emergence via the wildlife trade. He wrote this in 2022, December 2022. This is not that long ago. This is a year ago. A recent report by the Independent Task Force on COVID, I don't know who they are, published in National Academy of Science, reveals the considerable peer-reviewed literature that the preponderance of the evidence is most consistent with COVID-19's origin as a zoonotic infection within the wildlife trade. I think this is vastly untrue. While a lab leak cannot be absolutely ruled out, the independent task force found no verifiable or credible evidence or scientific data to support this interpretation. Now, who are they? I have no idea.
So here's another thing. So I can walk you through this real quick. So first of all, the first task force that is assembled, the U.S. government assigns Dr. Peter Daszak to be the lead investigator with the WHO about the origin of the coronavirus pandemic. Everyone soon finds out shortly thereafter that Dr. Peter Daszak was involved in this gain of function work, and how can this guy be the person in charge? So he has to recuse himself from the Lancet Commission. The Lancet Commission, these other medical commissions, are all in PNAS, are all very closely tied and related to each other. A lot of the scientists were all in sort of the same sphere together, so it's political in nature. But to say that,
just as a sidelight, the current head of the UN Human Rights Commission is Iran.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good analogy. So, taking this one step further, though, so here you have Daszak, who's been trying to mislead the investigation since day one, and so then there's materials that he's quoting in that paragraph that there's no evidence that this could be from a laboratory leak. Well, that's false. There's actually a lot of intelligence reports, and if you actually look at the genetic sequences and the phylogenetic tree, we know for a fact that there is one missing ancestor between Rat13 and HKU, which is missing. And the question is where it is. Well, I have a pretty good idea where it is. And this is something that's pretty interesting. I talk about in my book. So a gentleman comes into my life by the name of Mike Bennett. He pretends that he wants to do business with my company. Quickly after making some small talk about my company, he starts engaging me in all this conversation about EcoHealth Alliance. He knows all the people who works there. He knows all about virology. He knows all about gain of function work. And after about my third conversation with this guy, I tell him, you're a CIA agent and you're from intelligence, aren't you? No, I'm not from intelligence. And so I wanted to validate this. So I came up with a clever way of doing it. So I had a hard drive in my house, and I'm like, I'm going to tell Mike Bennett that I have the missing sequence data on this hard drive when I worked from EcoHealth Alliance. So I told Mike Bennett that I think I have the missing sequences on that hard drive. Well, guess what? That hard drive went missing from a safe in my house the next day. Think about that.
Did you have a copy someplace?
Oh, yeah, I have a copy of it. But there were no sequence data on it. That's the thing. I bluffed him. So he stole a hard drive, and here's the best part. That hard drive actually contained a bunch of different national security information on it about food and agriculture facilities and the methods and all the raw data, which was informed top secret research and designation from my time as a PhD student. So not only did he steal, not get the data, I set him up with basically national security data theft. Well, this is how I validate it. So I reported the data theft to the FBI, Department of Energy, DHS, USDA, and FDA, and then the different stakeholders. No investigation of the theft of these data ever occurred. So what do you think, reading between the lines, who do you think has
pretty good? That's kind of TV movie quality, subterfuge. Nice job.
Well, hey, when you run with these people, and I spent enough time in DC, it is really like the show Game of Thrones. Everyone's trying to get to the top. I was never one of those people, but if I ever got pushed the wrong way, I knew exactly how to always beat these people at their own game, and that's why I've been so successful in pushing Congress and all these other different.
What are you doing for a living now?
I've been fighting this fight full time. I'm actually considering a run in office. We have an exploratory committee, and I might run for Congress.
How about president?
I've heard that. The district, I'm not kidding. So I actually sat in a meeting, and here's the thing: I don't want to do this job. If I really don't. I used to make more money in working in tech and biotech after I left academia, and that's really what my passion is. The problem is we have such few good leaders who are willing to fight. I don't know how we've cracked the situation unless we get better people into it.
All right, so let's start with Congress.
I might. We'll find out.
Which district? In UP?
What's that?
Which district?
First district in Minnesota. Of Michigan.
You better get the state right.
Well, I grew up in Minnesota. I live in Michigan. I had to.
All right. Well, let me know. I'll contribute to that. Yeah, that's fascinating. So I'm going to end with a promotion of your book. I'm going to give you a little bit of last word comments, and then I'm going to take the last word and do a self-promotion. So let's have people take a look at your book over here. This is where you can buy it, amongst others, I assume. The Truth About Wuhan, how I uncovered the biggest lie in history. And it sounds like there's a whole bunch of them. So tell us a little bit about what your final message would be for people.
Well, my final message is that I actually think that the quote unquote the Great Awakening is happening. We're in the midst of it right now. It's going to take place, and the date of this interview is November 9th, 2023. It's going to be during the next month or two. And I think there's a lot of hope at the end of this. I think, we've pushed globalism to the edge. We've pushed the failed sort of political system in the United States to its edge. And I think next year we're going to probably elect a lot of better leaders and get control of a lot of the bad issues that we're having. So we went through this terrible period actually for about 3 or 4 years. I think it's coming to an end.
Excellent. So who is your current congressman in the 1st District?
Jack Bergman.
What side is he?
He's a Republican, and he's not a very well-liked Republican.
Would you run as a Republican or a Democrat?
A Republican.
Okay. So you'd primary him.
Correct. I'm a constitutional libertarian, and I'm all for dismantling certain parts of the government. Yeah.
Well, I think that's not unreasonable. So I'm going to give my final plug to myself. So this is, if you want to help support my podcast and these talks and so forth, you can buy this book. It's called Overturning Zika. It's on Amazon. It's even better if you read it, but at least buy it. And then I'll have an easier time. It comes loaded with a picture of me on the cover here. This is early in the morning. Actually, this is an 80s Egyptian mosquito. It's a fascinating story. People might have forgotten the other pandemic, 2015-16 Brazil. There was, this one has made it seem like child's play. I worked on this before COVID-19 was a thing. So I started on working on this in 2019 as an article. And I tried to get published, and I was going to get published in JAMA. I had a Zoom call with the erstwhile 2 chief editors, medical and regular editor of JAMA, and they thought my theory was excellent about, basically, long story short, is that Zika is a real virus, and microcephaly is a real but very rare congenital issue. And it just so happens that one doesn't cause the other. I mean, Zika's been around for 70 years or whatever. I mean, probably forever. We've known about it for 1947 in the Zika forest, which is not really a forest, really a suburban park in Kampala, which is a city of, like 1.5 million people. And it's been around in a kind of a suburban urban area forever, never caused any microcephaly, never caused any human illness. Maybe it's a chimp virus, who knows? It's basically the fifth. There are 4 dengues. They're named 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Zika is probably just the 5th dengue. It just doesn't happen to be a human dengue. And dengues never cause microcephaly, and they're completely, essentially identical. Genomic, not quite, identical, but they have a huge overlap genomically. You can't test them. There's a lot of cross-reactivity. Anyway, dengue's been around in Brazil endemically for decades, if not centuries, and never caused any microcephaly. They didn't have a microcephaly registry in Brazil. They had no way of comparing one year to the other, and so forth and so on. And then hilarity ensues. Basically, somebody announced that the Zika was there when it was actually dengue. They probably got a little bit of self-aggrandizement, promotion in the medical academic world in Brazil. They got the notoriety, fame, so forth. And I think people do this kind of stuff. As we were talking about a little bit, in the EcoHealth Alliance, I think humans are involved in this, and it's not just politicians that are corruptible and making mistakes. Regular humans do that, and it's possibly science and medicine as well. Anyway, for better or for worse, they announced that Zika was a thing. Had never, caused any human illness. They said it was in Brazil doing that. Had never been in Brazil, and they didn't have any Zika tests. And then somebody else separately in Recife, in northeast Brazil, thought there was more microcephaly. Usually, it's about 7 or 8 cases for a city that big. At this point, there were maybe 15. Not a big deal, not a big blip. They had no way of comparing how many other years had numbers like that because they had no registry. They didn't have firm standards. It's kind of a bleep show. I don't want to use the word, but fecal matter show, and it just blossomed horribly. The irony and the oddity is that there was a group in northeast Brazil where they wanted a new strange illness to show up in northeast Brazil. They formed their group of physicians and epidemiologists and whatnot. They called it CHIKV, the mission, for chikungunya virus. So they called it CHIKV, the mission. And they named it after 1986 Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons movie, The Mission, where the colonialists are the bad guys, the native population are the good guys, and the Jesuits kind of help the Guarani Indians in Paraguay and whatnot. Anyway, they saw themselves as the same type of zealots to help the native population and bring money and attention to Brazil's poor northeast. And so they wanted a virus to show up. They wound up not settling on chikungunya, which didn't cooperate virally, and they wound up misdiagnosing dengue cases as Zika, and they were off to the races. And lo and behold, they succeeded far beyond their wildest imaginations, and money and attention did pour in, but it has brought grief because the birth rate has gone down. They're probably, worldwide, they're probably 500,000 what I call ghost children who didn't come to be because of outright fear over the Zika infection, microcephaly. The WHO line physicians told people to stop having babies completely until there was a virus, until there was a vaccine. It's let me check my watch, it's 2023. There's still no vaccine.
Yeah. And what's funny about this? So I've actually spent quite a bit of time in Brazil, and the amount of people that are in Brazil that believe that there's a Zika virus vaccine. So they actually have a terrible medical public health education level nationwide. And I was asking it when I was down there for work. I was asking, hey, do you think there's a Zika vaccine? And they're like, oh yeah, there's a Zika vaccine. Yeah. So people believe there's a vaccine when it doesn't exist.
And that's a funny thing. They're actually working there. This is an article I have to get writing on, but in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Dr. Anna Durbin is actually injecting and infecting women with Zika right now and lately, contrary to the NIH's own ethics panel advice not to do that because of Guatemala and Tuskegee and all that kind of stuff. So they don't want to get tagged with a public health disaster, a public relations disaster, and maybe a public health disaster. But they're doing it nonetheless because the money's burning a hole in their pocket. They have like $100 million left over from the $1 billion appropriated in 2016, and they are going about doing it, and they want a Zika vaccine. And lo and behold, as soon as one's out, it's going to get, in my view, it's going to get mandated or recommended worldwide to prevent a problem that doesn't really exist as a problem. The Zika, like I said, Zika is a real virus. It just doesn't happen to have any human sequelae, including not having the problem of microcephaly. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I mean, this is a classic. Sort of crony capitalism or corruption of government, or you could say regulatory.
Yeah, mixed in with a fair amount of gullibility and stupidity. Like I don't think everyone's in on the conspiracy. I just think nobody has pointed out the emperor's new clothes as